The message came at 1:12 a.m. Kang Tae-oh never received messages at 1:12 a.m. The phone on his bedside table lit up the dark penthouse, a notification from a number that did not exist in his contacts, and should not have existed at all. No text. No name. Just a GPS coordinate. He stared at it for 3 seconds. Then his pulse changed. For 3 years, Kang Tae-oh had buried a woman in an empty casket. For 3 years, he had dismantled every man responsible for the ferry explosion that was supposed to have killed her. And in 3 years, no one had dared use this number. But the coordinate wasn't random. It pointed to the southern coast of Jeju Island. And something about it felt intentional. Precise. Personal. He opened the map. The blue pin dropped near a lighthouse, isolated, wind-beaten, facing nothing but black ocean. His jaw tightened. If this was a trap, it was an expensive one. If it wasn't. He was already moving. Shoes on. Jacket. Gun. The elevator doors hadn't even closed before the second realization hit him. No one alive knew he still kept this number. Except one person. And she had been dead for 36 months. The car tore through Seoul's empty streets while the coordinate pulsed on his screen like a heartbeat. He hadn't cried at her funeral. He hadn't broken when he lowered an empty coffin into the ground. But this felt different. Because if Naomi was alive, then someone had lied. And if someone had lied, there was something waiting for him in Jeju. Something that would either give him back his life, or burn what was left of it to the ground. And at 1:12 a.m., Kang Tae-oh decided he would rather face a ghost than live one more day without answers. And by sunrise, he would discover that the dead do not return alone. The farm appeared at dawn, tucked between rolling hills heavy with tangerine trees. Tae-oh stepped out of the car before it fully stopped, the wet grass soaking through his Italian shoes. He didn't notice. Every nerve in his body was pointed forward like a weapon. She was in the yard. Her back was to him, hanging laundry on a low wire, her long dark hair loose around her shoulders. She was wearing a simple yellow dress, nothing like the silk and pearls he remembered. But he would have known the way she moved in a pitch-black room, in a different country, in a different life. Naomi. She went completely still. A white sheet hung between her hands like a flag of surrender. Then she turned around, and the face he had mourned for 3 years looked straight at him, and went carefully, deliberately blank. I think you have the wrong person. Her Korean was smooth and natural. Her eyes were steady. My name is Eun-ji. I live here alone. Tae-oh didn't move. He studied her the way he studied men who lied to him across negotiating tables, quietly, completely, missing nothing. Her hands had tightened on the sheet. You always twisted the hem of things when you were scared, he said softly. You did it the first night we met. You're doing it right now. Something flashed across her face, fast and unguarded, like lightning behind a closed window. Then it was gone. Please leave, she said. You have the wrong person. He didn't blink. Then tell me why you used my son's last name. He didn't leave. Tae-oh stepped past her through the open farmhouse door like he still had the right to, his eyes moving across the small, warm space. It was nothing like the penthouse she had shared with him in Seoul. Wooden floors. Hand-painted walls. A child's drawings taped crookedly above the kitchen table, colorful, wild, full of life. He stopped at the drawings. One of them showed 3 figures. A tall man with ink crawling up his neck. A woman with long dark hair. A small boy between them, holding both their hands. His chest tightened like a fist closing. He turned slowly. Naomi, Eun-ji, was standing in the doorway, watching him with the careful expression of someone waiting for a storm to arrive. How old? He asked quietly. She said nothing. He crossed to the low shelf beside the window. Among the folded papers and small household items, a single document lay slightly apart from the rest, as though it had been checked on recently. He picked it up before she could move. A birth certificate. Kang Taemin, age, 3 years, 2 months. Conception date, 11 weeks before the ferry explosion. The father's line was blank. But the boy's full name carried his family name like a flag planted in foreign ground. He read it twice. Then a third time, very slowly. When he looked up, Naomi's eyes were bright with something between relief and fear. "He has your eyes," she whispered. "He has always had your eyes." Taeo set the paper down carefully. His hands were not entirely steady. "Tell me everything," he said. They sat at the small kitchen table, a pot of tea between them that neither touched. Outside, the tangerine trees moved gently in the morning wind. Inside, everything was still. Naomi kept her eyes on her hands as she spoke. 3 years ago, 2 weeks before the ferry accident, she had intercepted a message meant for one of Taeo's lieutenants. The Lee Syndicate, his oldest and most patient enemy, had discovered she was pregnant. They weren't planning to kill her. That would have been simpler. Instead, they planned to take the child after birth, raise him inside their organization, and use his bloodline to eventually claim everything Taeo had built. An heir as a weapon. A son as a slow-burning knife. She had gone to Taeo's second-in-command for help. He had confirmed it was real. So they built the accident together. A borrowed body. A closed casket. A grief so convincing that even the Lee Syndicate's informants reported it as clean. "I wanted to tell you," she said. Her voice was steady but thin, like paper held over a flame. "Every single day I wanted to call you. But if you had known, you would have come for us. And they would have been watching you." She finally looked up. "Your love for me was the most dangerous thing in my world, Taeo. I had to hide from it to survive." He didn't argue. That told her everything. Taemin came home from the neighbor's house at mid-morning, tumbling through the front door with muddy knees and a tangerine clutched in each small fist. He stopped the moment he saw Taeo sitting at the table, studying him with the direct, fearless curiosity that only very young children possess. "Who are you?" he asked in Korean. "A friend," Taeo said carefully. Taemin considered this for exactly 2 seconds, then climbed onto the chair beside him and held out a tangerine. "You can have this one. It's the small one. I want the big one." Naomi didn't recognize the man on her kitchen floor. The real trouble came an hour later. She was called to the front gate by a delivery man and asked Taeo, with a look that dared him to refuse, to watch the boy for 5 minutes. Taemin chose those 5 minutes to announce, with great urgency and zero warning, that he needed changing. Taeo had negotiated with arms dealers. He had walked into rooms where every man present wanted him dead. He had never, in his entire life, changed a diaper. He managed it. Eventually. After putting it on backwards once, and after Taemin helpfully narrated every mistake in a running commentary that showed a remarkable vocabulary for a 3-year-old. When Naomi returned, Taeo was sitting on the floor looking quietly defeated. Taemin was patting his knee with one small hand. "Good try," the boy said generously. Taeo looked up at Naomi. Something in his expression had completely shifted, softer than she had ever seen it, and more frightened than any enemy had ever made him. "He's mine," he said softly. It wasn't a question anymore. The afternoon settled warm and quiet over the farm. Taemin had fallen asleep on the sitting room floor with a crayon still in his hand, a half-finished drawing of a horse spread beneath his cheek. Naomi was in the kitchen. Taeo stood on the narrow back porch, watching the tangerine trees. He had not survived this long by ignoring small things. It was the birds that told him first. A cluster of them lifted suddenly from the far row of trees, not frightened, but displaced, as though something had passed silently above them. His eyes moved upward without hurrying, scanning the pale sky the way other men scanned a menu. There. Between the tree line and the cloud cover, barely visible against the white morning haze. A small dark shape, hovering. Patient. Watching. A drone. Not local. Not hobbyist. Military-grade stabilization. Consumer model, modified. The kind that didn't show up on standard tracking apps. The kind someone bought specifically because it was quiet and hard to spot from the ground. Teo didn't move. He kept his posture loose, his face turned slightly away, giving whoever held the controller nothing useful to read. 3 seconds. 5. Then he stepped casually back inside as though he'd simply finished his tea. Naomi looked up from the counter. She read his expression immediately. "How long?" she asked. Her voice was very calm. "Long enough." He was already typing on his phone. They didn't come to watch the trees. He looked toward the room where his son was sleeping. "Pack only what matters," he said quietly. "Tonight we move." They didn't move that night. Teo's man on the ground confirmed the drone had pulled back before sunset, likely repositioning. Moving in the dark with a 3-year-old would create noise and exposure he couldn't afford. So he made a different decision. Instead of retreating, he would make the village too complicated to touch. He started in the morning. The collector arrived loud. He left silent. Teo settled the debts in cash and added enough to make a second visit unnecessary. The village understood. By afternoon, the villagers knew something had shifted. An elderly woman brought fresh fish to Naomi's door without explanation. Naomi found Teo on the porch, watching the road. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know," he replied simply. "It started because of the rain." A heavy afternoon shower rolled in from the coast and trapped them all inside, the farmhouse filling with the smell of wet earth and tangerine peel. Naomi set Taemin up at the kitchen table with his finger paints, small plastic pots of red, yellow, blue, and a green that he used for almost everything regardless of what he was painting. Teo sat nearby, going through messages on his phone with the focused stillness of a man running calculations behind his eyes. Taemin studied him for a long moment. Then he looked at the paints. Then back at Teo. "Can I paint on you?" Teo looked up slowly. Naomi, standing at the counter, deliberately kept her eyes on the window. "On me," Teo repeated. "Your arm," Taemin said, already sliding off his chair with the pot of yellow. "It already has pictures. I want to add mine." Teo stared. Then Teo set his phone down and pushed his sleeve up, exposing the dense black ink that covered his forearm, dragons and smoke and old symbols that had taken years and considerable pain to earn. Taemin went to work immediately, his small tongue pressed between his teeth in concentration. Yellow suns. A lopsided horse. 3 figures holding hands. Teo watched his son paint over the marks of his old life and said nothing. Outside, a car engine idled longer than it should have. When Naomi finally looked over, the expression on Teo's face made her chest ache quietly. He looked, for the first time in 3 years, like a man who belonged somewhere. The call came just after midnight. Teo was on the porch, the farm dark and quiet around him, Taemin long asleep. He looked at the screen before answering. A Seoul number. Old. One he recognized the way a person recognizes a scar, not fondly, but completely. He picked up and said nothing. "You always did know how to make an entrance." Chairman Lee's voice was smooth and unhurried, the voice of a man who had never once needed to raise it to be obeyed. "Jeju this time of year. I'm told the tangerines are excellent." Teo kept his eyes on the treeline. "What do you want?" "Only to talk. The way old business partners should. I was so sorry to hear about your fiancé. 3 years ago now, wasn't it? Terrible accident. And yet here you are, all the way in Jeju, in the middle of the night. Funny how grief works." The words were soft. The meaning inside them was not. "If you touch them," Teo said quietly, "there will be nothing left of your organization worth counting." Chairman Lee made a gentle sound, almost sympathetic. "That is exactly the kind of emotional thinking that makes a man vulnerable, Teo. You built an empire on cold decisions. Look at you now. His voice dropped slightly. Come back to Seoul. Leave the ghost where she belongs. Or I will come to Jeju myself. The line went dead. Teo sat completely still for a long moment. Then he went inside and checked every lock in the house. Naomi had known the Haenyeo women for 2 years. They were women who feared the ocean less than most men feared guns. Elder GM was their leader in the way that water leads, not by forcing direction, but by finding every opening. She arrived at the farm before sunrise with 2 other women, carrying baskets that looked like a morning delivery of dried fish and sea vegetables. They were not delivering fish. Beneath the bundles were waterproof pouches, packed carefully with emergency documents, sealed cash, a spare phone, and a small medical kit. Elder GM had been listening to the village talk. She knew the loan collector had left without argument. She knew a man with Seoul ink on his neck was sleeping under Naomi's roof. She understood, without being told, that something was coming. She pressed Naomi's hands between her own rough palms and spoke in the low, direct way of women who have survived hard things. There is a storage cave below the eastern cliff, she said. The tide covers the entrance twice a day. They won't find it unless someone shows them. She looked steadily at Naomi. Nobody will show them. Naomi's throat tightened. Why are you helping me? Elder GM picked up her empty basket. Because you stayed, she said simply. Outsiders who stay are worth protecting. The festival had been planned for weeks before any of them arrived. Every year the village celebrated the tangerine harvest with lanterns and music and long tables of food set out in the main square. The villagers had debated canceling it this year, with the strange tension that had settled over the southern edge of town. Elder GM had overruled them all with a single look. Canceling, she said, would tell whoever was watching that the village was afraid. So the lanterns went up anyway, warm and golden against the darkening sky. Teo had positioned 2 of his men at the road entrances before the first song started. He had memorized the exits. He had done everything a careful man was supposed to do. Then Taemin grabbed both their hands and pulled them toward the music, and for a little while, carefulness became difficult. The village band played something old and unhurried. Taemin danced the way 3-year-olds dance, with his whole body and no sense of rhythm whatsoever, and the people around them laughed warmly. Naomi laughed too. It was the first time Teo had heard it in 3 years. He had forgotten what it did to him. He held out his hand without thinking. She looked at it for a moment, then took it, and they moved slowly together in the lantern light while their sun spun happily between them. Neither of them spoke. Some things were too careful and too fragile for words, and both of them knew it. The danger was still out there, patient and waiting. But for those few minutes, it could wait. It didn't. The festival lanterns were still glowing when Teo's phone buzzed. It was a data report from his security team in Seoul, a routine sweep he had requested 3 days ago and almost forgotten about. He read it once standing at the edge of the square, Taemin sleeping against his shoulder, Naomi quietly gathering the boys' scattered belongings nearby. He read it a second time. Then he understood. The GPS coordinates sent to his old phone at 1:12 a.m. had not come from Naomi. He had assumed it had. He had never actually stopped to question it because the result had been her, and his mind had closed around that fact like a hand closing around something precious. But the coordinate had been sent from a device registered to one of his own men. Young-ho. 7 years in his organization. Trusted with scheduling, with travel arrangements, with the private number on that old phone. Trusted, it turned out, with everything Chairman Lee needed. Young-ho hadn't betrayed him for money. The report showed something worse, a family debt, quiet and years old, that the Lee syndicate had been holding like a card waiting to be played. They had waited patiently for the right moment and then pressed down on exactly the right nerve. Teo did not feel anger. He felt adjustment. Teo handed Taemin carefully to Naomi without explanation. She searched his face. What happened? The coordinate wasn't a gift, he said quietly. It was a key. He looked toward the dark road leading out of the village. and we just opened the door for them. He worked through the night while Naomi and Taemin slept. Teo moved through the farm the way he had once moved through enemy territory, quietly, methodically, wasting nothing. His 2 men on the ground worked alongside him without conversation, understanding from long experience that their employer thought clearest in silence. He worked without speaking. By dawn, the farm looked peaceful. It was not. Naomi appeared in the doorway at dawn, holding 2 cups of tea. She looked at his face and then slowly at the yard. "How bad is it going to be?" she asked. Teo took the cup from her hand. "Bad," he said honestly. "But they won't find it easy." He didn't tell Taemin it was practice. He told him it was a game. After breakfast, while Naomi was outside checking the supply lines with Elder GM, Teo sat cross-legged on the farmhouse floor across from his son. Taemin looked back at him with those serious dark eyes that already understood more than most adults gave him credit for. "I'm going to teach you the most important game there is," Teo said quietly. "It's called Still and Silent. The winner is the person who can stay hidden the longest without making a single sound." Taemin straightened immediately, chin lifted. He was, Teo had already learned, extremely competitive for someone who still needed help with buttons. He showed him the cellar entrance beneath the kitchen rug, the low wooden door, the short ladder, the small space below that smelled like earth and cool air. He had already lined it with a blanket and a small flashlight and 3 tangerines, because he knew his son. "If I ever say the word orange," Teo said, "you go straight here. You pull the door. You stay silent. You wait for my voice or your mother's voice only. Nobody else's." Taemin nodded slowly. "What if you don't come?" The question landed with a weight the boy didn't fully understand yet. Teo held his son's small face gently between both hands. "I will always come," he said. "That's a rule that doesn't change." He had never promised anyone anything he couldn't deliver. Taemin considered this, then nodded firmly. He trusted it the way children trust things, completely, and without conditions. Teo wished, quietly, that he deserved it. They had the conversation after Taemin was asleep. Naomi sat across from him at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a cup that had long gone cold. The farmhouse was quiet around them, the night outside pressing close against the windows. Teo waited. He had learned, in the days since arriving, that she spoke important things in her own time and not before. "I'm not going back to Seoul," she said. He didn't react. He had been expecting it. "Teo, I know what you're thinking, that once this is over, once Chairman Lee is dealt with, we go back. We take our proper place. We live behind walls and security teams and bulletproof glass and call it a life." She looked at him steadily. "I did that for 2 years. I smiled at people whose names I wasn't allowed to know. I learned which questions not to ask. I watched you carry weight that was slowly making you into someone I was losing. Then I came here. And I learned what it feels like to live without fear as the background noise of every single day." Teo was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the tangerine trees moved in the night wind. "And Taemin?" he asked. "Taemin deserves a father," she said. "Not a king." Her voice was gentle but completely firm. "I'm not asking you to be less than you are. I'm asking you to figure out who you are without the empire." She held his gaze. "I need to know if that man exists." 1 week to the minute after the first ping lit up his phone, Teo was awake. He hadn't planned it that way. He simply hadn't slept. He sat in the dark kitchen at 1:11 a.m., his phone face down on the table, listening to the farm breathe around him. The tangerine trees. The distant pull of the ocean. Taemin's soft sounds from the back room. At 1:12, the first pressure sensor tripped. No sound. Just a small red light on the device in his palm, barely bigger than a match head. Then a second light. Then a third, in a sequence that told him exactly what he needed to know, not 1 man, not 2. At least 5, moving in a practiced spread across the eastern approach, trying to cover the property simultaneously. Professionals. He was already moving. Silent through the hallway, one hand on Naomi's shoulder before she had fully surfaced from sleep. Her eyes opened and found his face, and she understood without a word spoken between them. "Orange," he said quietly. She was up in one motion, lifting Taemin from his blankets with the practiced calm of a woman who had spent 3 years preparing for exactly this. The boy stirred but didn't cry. He remembered the game. Teo watched them disappear through the kitchen floor, the wooden door settling silently into place above them. Then he turned toward the front of the house. Outside, the tangerine trees had gone completely still. He checked his weapon once, the way careful men do, and moved to meet them. He went out through the pantry exit. The night air was cool and smelled of citrus and wet soil. Teo moved along the side wall of the farmhouse in a low crouch, staying in the shadow line where the moonlight didn't reach. He had walked this ground 100 times in the past week, in daylight and dark, until his feet knew it without asking his eyes. The first wire tripped 30 meters into the orchard. He heard the stumble, trained but unfamiliar. Teo was already there. It lasted 12 seconds. 2 men went down before they understood he was already inside their timing. A third tried to circle wide through the trees. Teo ended that too. He found the fourth near the back fence. The fifth had stopped moving entirely, which meant he had either retreated or repositioned for something Teo hadn't accounted for. He stood still among the trees, breathing evenly, blood running quietly down his wrist. The orchard had gone completely silent around him. Then, from the direction of the farmhouse, he heard something that stopped everything inside him. The cellar door. Someone had found the cellar door. He moved back through the orchard at a run, abandoning silence entirely. The pantry door was open when he reached it. He had closed it behind him. That single fact told him everything as he pushed through into the kitchen, his weapon up, scanning the room in one sweeping motion. Naomi was on the floor beside the overturned kitchen table, pressing her hand against a cut above her eyebrow. Alive. Conscious. Her eyes found him immediately. Her voice was flat. Controlled by force. One man. He came through the front while the others drew you to the trees. He knew exactly where the cellar was. The fifth man. Teo crossed to her in 2 steps, checked the cut with his hands, determined it wasn't deep. Then he looked at her directly. How long? 2 minutes. Maybe 3. He was back through the door before she finished speaking. Outside, tire tracks in the soft mud led toward the northern road, not the main village road, the old coastal track that ran along the cliff edge toward the eastern point. Teo's car was blocked by a fallen branch, deliberately placed. He ran. His phone was already at his ear. His man on the ground was pulling the second vehicle around from the lower field. Behind him he could hear Naomi following, and he didn't tell her to stop because he understood there was nothing in the world that would make her. His son was somewhere ahead in the dark. Everything else stopped mattering. The second vehicle reached them at the bottom of the northern track. Teo pulled open the back door and Naomi got in without a word. He took the front. His man handed him a phone showing a live feed. One of the sensors he had placed along the coastal road had a small camera attached, motion triggered, and it had caught 3 seconds of footage as a dark van passed. Taemin's face was visible through the rear window for exactly 1 second. Eyes open. Not crying. Something shifted in Teo in that moment, quietly and completely, the way a foundation shifts before a building comes down. The father stepped back. The Shadow King stepped forward. And the world would remember why it had feared him. He made 3 calls in under 2 minutes. His voice was level. Emotionless. The most dangerous version of him. He activated contacts he hadn't used since leaving Seoul. He called in debts that had been sitting untouched for years, the kind that men paid immediately and without question because the alternative was unthinkable. By the time the van reached the eastern coastal road, Teo knew its destination, its occupants, and the name of the man who had organized the grab. He also knew something Chairman Lee had apparently forgotten. The Shadow King had built his empire by being the most patient and the most prepared man in any room. He had simply been choosing, for the past week, not to be that man. He was done choosing. "Drive," he said quietly. "I'll tell you where." The cliffs rose black against the night sky. The van waited at the far end of the overlook, headlights off, the sea roaring below. Teo approached on foot from the tree line, alone. He had told Naomi to stay with the car. She had looked at him with an expression that was not agreement, but she had stayed. He understood it cost her more than anything she had done in 3 years of hiding. 2 men stood outside the van. A third was visible through the rear window. Taemin was a small shape beside him, still and quiet, honoring a game his father had taught him 4 days ago. Teo stepped out of the tree line into the open. "That's far enough." The voice came from his left, a 4th man he hadn't placed yet, positioned against the cliff face with a clear angle. Prepared. Patient. Teo stopped walking and looked toward the van. "I want to see him," he said. The rear door opened. Taemin looked out and found his father's face. A child finding his father. He didn't speak. He just looked. Teo held his gaze for 1 steady second, then cut his eyes left, a direction, not a glance, and Taemin, who was his father's son, understood. He dropped to the floor of the van. The distraction was exactly enough. Teo moved. Naomi had not stayed with the car. She had waited exactly long enough for Teo's figure to disappear into the tree line, then she had gone the other way, down the narrow goat path that ran along the cliff base, the one she had walked 100 times in 2 years of early mornings when the island was still quiet and belonged only to the people who knew it well enough to find its hidden edges. She knew these cliffs by memory. Every shelf. Every blind turn. She had called Elder Jiam from the car before leaving it. By the time she reached the lower shelf beneath the overlook, 3 of the Haenyeo women were already positioned along the base path, silent and sure-footed in the dark, each carrying tools built for survival. The plan was simple because simple things worked in the dark. When Teo created his distraction above, Naomi moved. The path from the overlook to the road had only one safe route down, the same path every person who didn't know these cliffs was forced to use. She knew exactly where it narrowed to a single file between 2 rock faces. She waited there. The first man came through at a run and found the path blocked in a way he hadn't accounted for, by a woman who had spent 2 years learning every secret this island kept. He didn't get past her. The overlook was quiet when it was over. 2 of Chairman Lee's men were restrained. One had taken the cliff path and met Naomi. The 4th had made the mistake of running toward the tree line. Only one remained standing in the open space between the van and the cliff edge, a young man in an expensive coat, composed in the way of people who have never yet faced a consequence they couldn't buy their way out of. Lee Jun-seo. The chairman's only son. Teo recognized him from photographs, younger, sharper, his father's eyes without his father's patience. He had been in the van the entire time, directing rather than acting. That single detail told Teo everything about what kind of man he was. Jun-seo straightened when Teo approached. To his credit, he didn't step back. "My father said you'd come for the boy personally," he said. "He said that was your weakness." "He's right," Teo said simply. He stopped 2 meters away. "Where's your father now?" "Seoul." "Watching." "Then watch carefully." Teo's voice was very quiet. "Your father sent his son to do this work. That tells me he's afraid to come himself. Afraid men make mistakes." He held Jun-seo's gaze without blinking. "Go back to Seoul. Tell your father that touching my family again will cost him something money cannot replace." He stepped closer. "Tell him I said it personally." Jun-seo left without another word. Teo turned back toward the cliff path, toward Naomi, toward the small figure she was already carrying up from the rocks. Teo let him leave alive on purpose. His son was safe. They were back at the farmhouse before dawn. Taemin had fallen asleep against Naomi's shoulder in the car, His small fist curled in her hair the way he slept when something had unsettled him and he needed to feel her close. She carried him inside and put him down without waking him, then came back to the kitchen where Teo was sitting with a cloth pressed against the cut on his forearm, staring at nothing in particular. She sat across from him. They were both quiet for a long time. "He'll send someone else," Teo said finally. Junesio delivered the message, but Chairman Lee doesn't stop. He's never stopped at anything in his life. He set the cloth down. As long as Kong Teo exists, they have a reason to come here. Naomi looked at him steadily. "What are you saying?" "The Shadow King needs to disappear," he said. "Permanently. Not an accident. Something they can verify. Something final." The silence that followed was heavy and careful. "If Kong Teo is dead," she said slowly, "then there's no heir. No target. No reason to come to Jeju. No empire. No enemies. No reason for any of this to continue." He looked at his son sleeping in the next room. Just a man with a different name living quietly on a farm. Naomi was still for a long moment. "Can you do that?" she asked. "Can you actually let it go?" Teo looked at her with complete honesty. "I already have," he said. Mino arrived on the afternoon ferry. Teo had called him at dawn with a single instruction: come alone, tell no one, bring the documents he kept in the third drawer of the Seoul office safe. Mino had asked no questions. He never did. It was the quality Teo had valued most in him across 11 years of complete loyalty. He looked older than Teo remembered. Or maybe Teo was the one who had changed. They sat on the back porch while Naomi kept Taemin inside. The tangerine trees were heavy with late fruit, the afternoon light falling gold and unhurried across the farm. Teo slid the documents across the table. He signed away everything in under 2 minutes. Mino looked at the papers for a long time without touching them. When he finally looked up, his expression was controlled but not entirely. "And you?" he asked. "Kong Teo will be confirmed dead within the week. Your people will report it. Lee's people will verify it. It ends there." Mino was quiet. Then he picked up the pen. "You were the best of us," he said simply. "I'm trying to be better than that," Teo replied. Mino signed without another word. They sat together in the afternoon light for a while longer, two men at the end of something, before Mino stood, picked up his ferry ticket, and walked back down the road without looking back. 3 days later, the new names arrived exactly as promised. He brought the envelope inside and opened it at the kitchen table. 3 passports. 3 clean identities. A farm registered under a name that had never existed before. He was Park Jinwoo now. A simple name. Unremarkable. Naomi sat beside him and looked at her own passport for a long quiet moment. The photograph was recent. Taken quietly in the village. The name underneath it was one Naomi had chosen herself. She had chosen to keep her first name. Teo looked at her. "It's mine," she said simply. "They don't get that either." He understood completely. Taemin's passport listed both their names as parents, printed plainly in black ink, the most ordinary and extraordinary thing Teo had ever seen on a piece of paper. The boy was currently in the yard attempting to climb the lowest branch of the largest tangerine tree with the focused determination he applied to everything. Teo watched him through the window for a moment. Then he gathered all 3 passports and placed them in the small fireproof box Naomi kept beneath the kitchen floorboards, beside the emergency supplies and the dried tangerine peels she saved for winter tea. He closed the box carefully. Kong Teo was gone. Park Jinwoo had a family to take care of. The farm was completely quiet. Taemin had been asleep for 3 hours, worn out from an afternoon of serious tree climbing and an evening of equally serious tangerine eating. The village beyond the tree line was dark and still. The ocean moved in the distance the way it always did, steady and indifferent and somehow comforting. Naomi was already in bed when Teo came inside from the porch, where he had been sitting in the cool night air doing nothing in particular. just listening. Just being present in the silence without searching it for danger. It had taken practice. It was getting easier. He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his phone for a long moment. The GPS application was still there on the old device, the one that had received the coordinate 11 weeks ago at exactly 1:12 in the morning. He had kept it without fully understanding why. Deleting it felt like closing the last door. He deleted it now. Not because the night no longer mattered. Because it had already done everything it was ever going to do. He set the phone face down on the small wooden table and lay down beside Naomi in the dark. She was awake. He could tell by the quality of her stillness. Her hand found his in the space between them. Outside, the tangerine trees moved softly in the night wind. His son was sleeping soundly in the next room. The ocean kept its steady conversation with the shore. At 1:12 a.m., for the first time in 3 years, Kang Tae-oh, Park Jin-woo, closed his eyes. And slept. The world could look for Kang Tae-oh. It would never find him again. But men like Chairman Lee do not forget. If you were him, would you have let Jun Seo walk away?